Hello, BookTube and all Repairman Jack fans. My name is Nathan. Thank you so much for watching and welcome to my channel. So this is my long discussion video for Infernal, which is the 9th book in the Repairman Jack series. The one that comes before this is Crisscross, and the one that comes after this is Harbingers. So Infernal was first published in 2005, and I think it is worth pointing out that it being the 9th book means that I am now into the second half of the original Repairman Jack series. Now, what I mean by that is there were originally 16 books that got published from the Tomb all the way up to the revised edition of Night World. So there's 16, so now that I'm on to 9, I'm in the second half of it. So we're getting closer and closer to Night World, and more of the events in the books are kind of leading up to this. The reason, though, that that's not really the second half is that there's other Jack books, which we know. So for one thing, there are the young adult Jack books. There's the trilogy. There's also Jack the Early Years, the crime thrillers, which I will read those as well. This winter or fall, then we're going to get another Repairman Jack book, which is going to fit into the original series, into the timeline of the original series, which is going to be called The Last Christmas. So there's that, which will then bring the series to 17, and then like that series proper from the Tomb all the way up to Night World. And then there is also going to be a Repairman Jack graphic novel, which I'm really excited for. So I think that'll be great, and I don't know what's going to happen with that, where it's going to fit into the timeline. But for right now, I'm basically in the second half of the original series. So Infernal is a really interesting book, in part because you don't have much of a villain in this book. So I'm going to give you a pretty quick plot summary, and then I'll get into some points of discussion. So at the end of Gateways, then you find out that, Jack's father ends up surviving. He almost gets killed at the end of Gateways, but he doesn't. And I don't think that's much of a spoiler, but I hope that you've read the other books in the series up to this point. Otherwise, I think this would be fairly confusing. But basically, his father, Tom, almost gets sucked away into this tornado when they're out there in the Everglades at the end of the book, and Jack basically threatens this force that is trying to kill off his father, saying, like, don't you do it, don't you do it. Well, at the beginning of Infernal, then his father is visiting. So he's visiting for Christmas time because he's still got his condo down in Florida, but he wants to move back to New Jersey. But since he hasn't sold it yet, he's still living there. So he flies back. He goes to the airport. Jack is supposed to be there to pick him up. So he goes in. He meets his father at baggage claim. And then he says, all right, I'm going to get out of here because he's uncomfortable with all the security guards being around. He goes and gets the car. And then what ends up happening is you have this small group of terrorists who come in with submachine guns that are Tokarevs, I think they're called. They're Israeli-made machine guns, and the terrorists, they go after everyone who's there at baggage claim, and then you find out, and the reason why I'm bringing up that they're Israeli weapons is because they are specifically, and it sure seems like they are specifically going after a group of, I believe they're Hasidic Jews who were on the plane. There's like 50 of them, of the 100-something people on the plane, and they kill all of them in the attack, and so that's why there's this irony in using Israeli weapons to kill Jewish people. So that's essentially how it starts, and then Tom, Jack's father, ends up getting killed as part of this attack. So Jack is now dealing with this thing. You get terrorism that was already introduced before this, because you get references to September 11th, because this does happen several books into the series, and Wilson had to start incorporating global terrorism into the books. But this is where it really starts coming into the series. And so Jack doesn't know what to do, because this is, of course, a difficult foe to fight against, right? I mean, the entire United States military has struggled to defeat different terrorist groups. And so Jack working all on his own, like, that's a tall order for him to do. But that doesn't really comprise most of the book. Really what most of the book is dealing with is Jack and his brother Tom. So Tom Jr., named after their father, Tom Sr. Now, Jack can't take care of the body. He can't claim his father's body because he has no identity to actually prove that he's related to him. So he insists that his brother come to New York City to deal with all of that. And this is where Infernal ends up being really kind of like a small little group of books within the Repairman Jack series of the family books. So there's hosts where Jack meets he essentially reunites with his sister Kate because they have not been in touch for like 15 years, basically since the death of their mother. Then Jack goes off to the city, he disappears, and he really doesn't contact his family anymore. So Kate in the book Hosts, she ends up realizing who Jack is and his real identity and what he actually does for a living. Gateways is the second family book where Jack meets with his father and his father realizes what he's doing. And then Infernal is really the completion of that because he's only got those three direct family members. Because there's of course Gia and Vicky, and Gia is pregnant at this point. So you've got all of that. But as far as his direct family where he grew up with them, there's just the three of them. And so now in Infernal, you get Tom Jr., who finds out exactly who Jack is, what he's really doing with his life, and starting to get introduced to more and more of the secret history of the world and the otherness and the cosmic battle that's going on between the otherness and the ally. So that's essentially how I'm reading it, right? That you've got Hosts, Gateways, and then Infernal. And that would be an interesting way of reading the series if you took those three and you're like, well, those are the family books, and you kind of read them in that way. So you find out that Tom Jr., he is a judge in Philadelphia, but he is in big trouble. He is a corrupt judge. He has essentially had a for sale sign hanging around his neck for a number of years where he is just open to any kind of bribery, anything that would generate him favors or anything like that. He is willing to do essentially anything. And he is getting into deeper and deeper trouble because the FBI is coming after him, and so he is on the verge of going to prison for a very long time. He realizes that he needs to escape. That's his only hope of avoiding a long-term prison sentence would be to essentially go underground, to get a new identity and to disappear. His plan for doing this is to take a yacht that he doesn't own, but somehow he has access to, and he's a little coy about this with Jack, but to take a yacht that he has from North Carolina, travel to Bermuda, access his bank account there and his safety deposit box. So this is a bank account that he has that, as far as he knows, the feds have no idea that he has this at all in Bermuda. So that's his plan. He convinces Jack to go along with him, and then during the actual journey, he's like, oh yeah, and by the way, there's also this treasure map that I have. So, if we have some extra time, doesn't that sound interesting? Jack's like, no, it doesn't. And Tom can't actually access his funds from the bank because the feds have already been there. So then he's essentially saying, Jack, we have got to try to excavate this treasure, and it's my only hope to essentially escape prison. So Jack very, very reluctantly agrees to help with this. It turns out to be one of the 7 infernals that are outlined in the Compendium of Screm, or Srem. So that is Srem, the Compendium, which you saw in Crisscross. So in Crisscross, when Jack is going up against the Dormentalist Church, then Luther Brady, who is the head of the Dormentalist Church, he has got the Compendium of Screm, and essentially from reading it, this is where he has come up with the idea of Operation Opus Omega, which is to plant different columns or pillars at strategic points across Earth, essentially at nexus points, which he doesn't entirely understand exactly what will happen, but ultimately what this is doing is every time he implants one, he is bringing the ladies and their dogs closer and closer to death, and when he completes this, then they are going to be gone, which means Earth will really not have them as protectors anymore to stop the otherness from taking over, or and it's really going to help the otherness to be able to achieve essentially what we see in Night World, right? And so the lady and the dog, they are there to try to keep Earth out of the hands of both the ally and the otherness. And so if they get killed off, then, basically Earth is in big trouble. And so that's where Luther Brady comes up with this idea from the Compendium of Screm. So Jack ends up having to find this book because they do excavate the treasure. They find it, and it is, like I say, it's one of the 7 Infernals. The other 6 Infernals we know nothing about. The 7th one, though, is called the Lilithong of Gafreda, and what it does, it essentially helps you to elude any enemies you might have. So it is a little bit bigger than a basketball. It is essentially a very dark brown or a black leather ball that doesn't really seem that interesting. Now, what ends up happening is they bring it back to Jack's apartment. Jack is there with Vicky. Vicky touches it. It's got a little navel on it, so she pokes her finger in there, and then she gets this black spot on her back, which then starts spreading and spreading. Jack ends up realizing what's going on, and essentially she's got something like 85 hours to live, because she's going to be transported somewhere else. Somewhere where her enemies could never find her. It is unclear whether it is the otherness, that she's going to go into the world of the otherness, or whether it's going to be something else entirely. That is all unclear. But it's obviously a big problem. Through finding, so Jack ends up going back to Luther Brady's cottage, to his shack. He finds the Compendium of Screm, which is this book that is absolutely ancient and it cannot be destroyed in any way, no matter what you do. Fire won't hurt it. You can't cut it up. You can't do anything. It will not be destroyed. So Jack finds the book. Gia goes through it, realizes that there is a secret spell in there that will allow the person who conducts this to be able to transfer the spot from one person to another, but it does nothing to the countdown. It's still counting down, like it'll still keep going at that same rate. So she takes the black spot on herself. Very, very quickly, Jack realizes what's happened. He then takes the spot from Gia. He puts it on himself, and again, I am spoiling essentially everything in this because this is a whole plot summary. At the last second, then Tom Jr. ends up arriving, and he takes the black spot on himself and disappears. That's essentially the book. Now, there is this a small little subplot of Jack going after the group of terrorists called the Wrath of Allah. And it is a group of Muslim men in, I'm trying to think, I believe they're in New Jersey. And he goes after them along with this guy that he knows who is connected, or he's semi-connected to the mob, and they go after the group, and it doesn't go very well, but they essentially kill everyone in there, and then Jack's friend who is helping him with this, he ends up getting killed. But really, that's a pretty small part of the book. And so this is why I'm saying that the book itself really has no villain. So you do have the Wrath of Allah as a villain in this book, but they're not in it very much. Like maybe like 20 pages, 30 pages out of a 420 page book. So that's actually pretty insignificant. And that's unlike most of the Repairman Jack books, which is one of the things that I absolutely love about the series, is that the books are not formulaic. It's not like, they're just following the exact same plot from one book to the other. And it's just, a slightly different villain this time, but they're going to, all follow the same formula, that you get different genres, different themes in each book. You have got, in this case, like I say, it's more of a treasure hunt and this supernatural object of trying to unravel a mystery behind it, and what do you do and how do you deal with this kind of a threat. So that's essentially what we've got in Infernal. You do get some familiar characters that come up in this book. So you do have another lady and a dog in Bermuda. This is a lady and a dog that we have not seen yet. So she is a young girl. I believe, like, it's Tom who sees her, and I believe that he says that she doesn't really have a Bermudan accent, but that she's got more of a Jamaican accent. But in any case, we see her. So That's another lady and a dog. You've also got Lyle and Charlie from the Haunted Air. So they kind of help the plot along at different points. So Charlie, he is dead at this point, but he is a ghost in part because of the house that they're in Menelaus Manor. So you've got those familiar characters. And like I say, you've got the Compendium of Screm, so you've got those interesting connections to Crisscross. Now, I've got a few different points of discussion that I wanted to mention. So, one of the really easy things that I want to talk about, as in, I don't have a whole lot to say with it, but I just want to point this out. You've got some interesting textual features in this book. For one thing, you do have flashbacks, and the flashbacks are interesting. So you've got flashbacks to this priest. I thought that I wrote his name down, but I guess I didn't. So he is a priest, Francisco Mendez, brother Francisco Mendez, member of the Society of Jesus. So this is in Spain in 1598. So only 6 years after Columbus has essentially, like, for Europeans, discovered the New World, right? Of course, for the Native Americans, they were well aware that it existed, but this is the European discovery of the Americas. So it's only 6 years after that. Well, he's essentially been commanded by the Pope, by Clement I think it's the seventh or eighth, that he needs to take the Lilitung of Gefreda, this ball. He needs to take this and take a whole ship out to Bermuda, which are, I forget what they're called at this point, but they're these islands that nobody's interested in part because they have these coral reefs around it, and so it's incredibly difficult to actually get into the islands, and so ships don't really want to approach that, because if they don't know where any channel is, then you're basically going to get shipwrecked, and that's obviously not a good thing in 1598. So the Pope orders him to essentially take over a ship, kill off everybody on there somehow, because I don't think it's actually clear of how he achieves this, but basically kill off everyone and then dump that thing, just off the coast of Bermuda, and then get on a ship that was traveling only a day or two behind, and then go back to Spain and deal with this awful infernal thing, literally one of the 7 infernals. It's an interesting thing because you don't get a lot of subplots like that, and I think that Wilson probably could have written the book without including that. I think it's good that he did. I enjoyed that. It's just interesting that it's just all of a sudden we're going back in time 400 years in this flashback. So I'm trying to think if there's another book aside from The Tomb where he does this, at least up until this point in the series. Because in The Tomb, then you definitely have that. You've got what's happening with I think it's the Westphalen family, and how they discover the Rakoshi monsters in India and how they kill them off. And this is why Kusum is so angry with the Westphalen family. So you do have that whole flashback there. But I don't know if we've seen that in any other book. So it's an interesting thing that you get that other little subplot in here. The other thing that is an interesting textual feature is that you have a countdown that happens. So after Vicky touches the Lilitung of Gefreda, and then she gets the black spot on her back, and then she's got like 85 hours or so as it's counting down before she will end up disappearing. Well, what Wilson does is he just has a countdown at the beginning of every chapter. So it's just got a minus symbol and then the number of hours and minutes remaining. And then he doesn't even really point this out. It's just you start as you continue reading. Because at first when you look at this, you're like, what is this countdown? What is this associated with? What's going to happen? As you continue reading, then you realize what's going on. So I think it's helpful and it's fun. It's a useful feature of the text. It's just interesting because it kind of comes out of nowhere, and I don't think that we've seen that countdown feature before. I think it works well, though, with the books, with the way they're structured in general, because the way he structures them is it's just he's got different parts to the book, and the parts are what day of the week it is. So you can kind of keep track of the chronology of events in the book, and it's such a simple way of organizing it and conveying that to the reader. You just know This is one day. Every time I'm reading it, it starts on, let's say, Monday. And then when you get to the end of the section, you know, all right, that's the end of that day. Now we're into Tuesday. Now we're into Wednesday. So he's always kind of providing you with some chronology to the books as a feature of the text. So putting the countdown in, I think, well, it fits. It makes sense. It's just we haven't seen that until this book. So that was one thing. Another thing that I wanted to mention would be terrorism, the theme of terrorism in the books. So I can't remember. I'm not sure if I brought it up already in the short spoiler-free review video that I did for Infernal. But basically, Wilson is now having to contend with the global threat of terrorism since September 11th happened. So this book was published in 2005. At this point, then, you're several years removed from September 11th, and you've got the war on terror overall that's going on. So you've already got the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq. So all of that is happening, and you've got, I can't remember, I'm trying to think back to 2004 because I can't remember when some of these other terrorist attacks happened, like the London Underground bombing, and then you had attacks, various, like several in Paris. And so they're somewhere around there. But terrorism in the early 21st century just became this, became increasingly apparent of this threat that is very, very difficult to fight against. And it's an interesting thing that Wilson, like, he is kind of compelled to bring this into the books because you've now got this new villain existing in reality, in the real world, actual enemies who are very difficult to identify, very difficult to stop by really any kind of law enforcement. It's very, very difficult to stop a terrorist attack from happening. And then even if you catch the people afterwards, it's like, well, the damage has been done. And so it's still good to achieve justice in capturing them. But ultimately, that is just, it's such a difficult threat to deal with. And now Jack is forced to deal with this, that his father gets killed in this attack. And what is Jack supposed to do with this? How does he fight? How does he achieve justice when that kind of attack happens? Because these books are very much about justice. Jack is, like, I mean, that's really what the series is. It's vigilante fiction. He's an urban mercenary, but really I consider these books to be vigilante fiction, where he is trying to right the wrongs that exist with all of the gaps that exist in the entire law enforcement system, in the entire judicial system, that there are big gaps there. And justice is not always done. Justice is not always achieved going through traditional means, and that's where Jack steps in. And it's unclear of how exactly he can deal with that. How can he fix that? And essentially, like, he can't. He does try to do this at the end with attacking all of the people with the wrath of Allah. But like I say, that's not a Jack solution. Jack's solutions are typically he rights a wrong, but you can't right that. You can't bring these people back from the dead. It's not people who got ripped off, because that's typically what Jack is doing. He's helping people where it's like, that person stole money from me, or that person injured me, or that person is, blackmailing me, or different things like that, where Jack can actually solve those things and make it better, but he can't in this situation. And I think that's kind of how the entire world was feeling at that point. Even if you're able to defeat Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, even if you're able to take out Iraq, which, you had various people in intelligence insisting that Iraq, had not only weapons of mass destruction, but was sponsoring terrorism. And so even if you do achieve those things, that doesn't undo September 11th. That doesn't undo the other attacks that have already happened. So how do you right that wrong? And it's essentially, Jack is dealing with this issue of there are essentially some bells that you can't unring. There are some problems that Repairman Jack just cannot solve. And terrorism is one of those, and especially with his father, right? Losing his father in this way. So that's an interesting thing that's happening in the book. This is not the only time that terrorism comes up in the books, but that's an interesting point. All right. The last thing that I really wanted to get into would be the religious themes of this book. And this, I mean, I've got a lot here that I'm working through as I'm reading this and as I'm thinking through this. But Jack is essentially a religious figure in this book. Now, this is not the only time that he comes across as a religious figure, and this is not the only time that faith or religion is being explored in the series. But I want to point this out. So let me just briefly go through this. On page 90, then Jack describes his profession like he's a priest. And so it says on my, like in my edition, the end of chapter 6 on page 90 says, told you I did a fix-it for him a few years back. It had been a simple fix, but Big Head had been impressed and had never forgotten. Which tells me nothing. It's not as if you're a priest and he told you something in confession. Yes, it is. Jack looked around again. Where the hell was Tom? But basically, yeah, sorry. And she's saying, like, you're still not going to tell me how you know this guy. Like, how do you know Big Head? And he's like, oh, I just helped him out with something. And she's like, tell me more than that. And, you know, it's not like you're a priest, Jack. It's not like your services are the confessional booth. And he's like, yes, it's exactly like that. I am a priest. And what you say to me is confidential. And I will not tell you what happened with my clients. Okay, that on its own you might not think is anything, but start thinking that way. Jack is a priest. Okay, the services he offers are akin to confession. All right, page 104. Then you've got the description of Tom Sr., so Jack's dad, and he's talking about affirmative action. And this is Jack describing it. So he is saying how his father essentially, you know, his father always thought that the person who was most qualified for the job should get it. And so before affirmative action, then he was advocating for a black candidate to get the job because the black candidate was the better candidate for the job. He had more experience, more education, skills that were more appropriate to it. So his father was saying, hey, yeah, we should get, you know, he should get the job instead of the white guy who has less education or experience. And then people didn't like this. And then after affirmative action, then I think there was a similar situation where a white guy gets a job instead of a black guy. So it says, then in the 90s, things exploded when he was directed to hire a black guy over a white guy. Dad refused because this time the white guy was better qualified. He still wanted the best guy. Dad hadn't changed, but the world had. The former commie, N-word lover was now a right-wing racist bigot. He couldn't take it and refused to be a part of a system that put ability second, so he opted out. Well, this is essentially the same description that you get for Jack. And what I want to point out here is this idea that his dad doesn't change, but society changes. And so his dad essentially is an ethical rock. His ethics are a rock. They do not change with the changing times. That right is right and wrong is wrong. I know what my value system is, and this is what it is. Circumstances are not going to change my value system. Peer pressure, societal pressure is not going to change my value system. I know what I believe, and you cannot shame me into not believing that. Well, that is essentially Jack, that you get a good description for Jack. So that's why I wanted to bring that up, is you first get that description for his father, but really that description fits Jack, and you'll see that in a little bit. But the other thing that I want to point out is that anybody, whether you're within the Judeo-Christian value system, within the Judeo-Christian tradition, so if you are Jewish, if you are any denomination of, like, any kind of Christian belonging to really any denomination, one of the fundamental principles is that the Bible doesn't change. Scripture doesn't change. God himself doesn't change. That the words of God, it does not matter when they were spoken. So when people will say, well, it's 2019, how can you still believe that? Or, well, Jesus said that, but he said that like 2,000 years ago. How can you still believe that? Jesus definitely wouldn't think that now. And for any Christian, they would say, yes, he would. Yes, he does. God doesn't change. Society might change. The value system of society might change. But God himself doesn't, because right is right and wrong is wrong. And just because a whole bunch of people start disagreeing with that doesn't change that value system. And that is the, like, for people of faith, that is the strength of relying on scripture to make decisions in life. That's essentially that's more or less what most religious people believe who are relying on an ancient text like that they are well aware that it's ancient. But that's the point, is that what was true back then continues to be true today. It is the difference between knowledge and wisdom, that it is providing you with wisdom, and wisdom is something that it doesn't matter what kind of piece of technology exists, it doesn't matter how high tech our society is, that wisdom remains the same. So you can gain wisdom from reading this ancient text. Well, Jack and his father have essentially got this value system. But it's not a value system that they're getting from elsewhere. Really, it's a value system that they have embedded within themselves. It's not entirely clear where their value system is coming from, but Wilson is pointing this out. So that's page 104. You do also get the whole subplot of Francisco Mendez. So this whole priest thing. So again, we're thinking religious concepts here. Now, page 266. In my edition, it's page 266. And Gia's description of Jack, you're going to notice it's very similar to the description of his father. She says, I didn't see it at first, but Jack is a rock. She smiled. The world flows past, but Jack doesn't move. Doesn't matter what's fashionable, what's in, what's out, what's politically correct, what's become legal, what's become illegal. Jack doesn't budge. I failed to appreciate that at first. I misunderstood him, got him all wrong, and ran from him. Said terrible, hurtful things to him. But when Vicky and I needed him, there he was, right where I'd left him. He was there for me then, and he's been there for me ever since. I can always depend on Jack to do the right thing. Okay. Let's try that again, except let me change that from Jack to God. Okay? So, G is saying this. I didn't see it at first, but God is a rock. And God absolutely gets described as a rock, if you know the Bible. The world flows past, but God doesn't move. Doesn't matter what's fashionable, what's in, what's out, what's politically correct, what's become legal, what's become illegal. God doesn't budge. I failed to appreciate that at first. I misunderstood him, got him all wrong, and ran from him. Think about how many people hear about God. They misunderstand him. They misunderstand Scripture. They're like, well, if that's God, I don't want to have anything to do with him, right? Keep thinking this way. Said terrible, hurtful things to him. But when Vicky and I needed him, there he was, right where I left him. He was there for me then, and he's been there for me ever since. I can always depend on God to do the right thing. I'm just pointing out here that her description is very much the description, the way people describe God, the way they describe who they believe to be their creator, their maker. That even if you have nothing to do with God, well, he's there, and you might turn your back on him, but he's still going to be there. That you might not understand him right away, but he has his value system. He knows what's right and what's wrong, and you can always trust him. So there's that. Page 335 to 336 of my edition. Then Jack is talking about trying to fight these terrorists, where he says, if it were a person or if it were alive, If it were alive and being controlled by someone, he could find a handle, have a chance. He could track down whoever it was and rearrange the guy's features and sundry other body parts until he gave up. A person, no matter how sick or depraved, he could deal with, he could understand. But this implacable, imperturbable, invulnerable, inexorably ticking bomb was indifferent, immune, just there. He swung at it until his arms gave out. Then, panting, sweating, he stopped, seething at his impotence. I apologize. That was not about the terrorists. That was about the Lilitung of Gefreda, right? That this thing has put its mark on Vicky, and she's going to disappear and to who knows where, to this other realm of existence. And he is fighting against this thing. So think about Jack being this religious figure. Well, he can't fight in the flesh. He now has to fight this thing that really is metaphysical. It is much more than a person. It's not things of flesh and blood, right? That if you know your scripture, then you know that that should tip you off. That that you are like it describes this in the New Testament as fighting against powers and principalities, right? It's not a physical battle. It's not a battle of the flesh. It's a spiritual battle that Christians are engaged in. And certainly Christ did this in his life. Then Christ, in being crucified, it was in part a physical battle, but really what he was doing is he was fighting a spiritual battle to ultimately pay the price for all human beings before and after. I imagine there may be some theologians who would want to parse that a little bit, but essentially Christ is dying for everyone's sins, and he is doing this thing that ultimately is a spiritual battle. And so Jack here is forced to try to confront this metaphysical thing, this cosmic war. He's being pulled into this world where you can't fight it the same way anymore. And it continues on like this, because if you think that I'm wrong in describing Jack in this way as a Christ-like figure, then, I mean, Gia herself describes him this way, where she's talking to Tom right before Tom disappears, and and even Tom, because of his interaction with Jack, because he spent time with him, because he's learned his value system and how he makes choices in life, Tom becomes changed just by being in the very presence of Jack. And so this is on page 415, where Tom says, because this is him offering to, like, he takes the spot from Jack, right? That he knocks Jack out with essentially like a roofie, right? With this drug, knocks Jack out, puts the whatever it is, like the ointment thing that on his hand, the concoction that Gia makes, and then puts it on Jack's back, and then gets the spot on himself. So he does this to save Jack and lays down his own life for his brother, where he says, "Never expected something like this from me." Yeah, well, that's the sad part, isn't it? Truth is, I'm more surprised than anyone. And until a few hours ago, I never expected anything like this from me either. But I got to thinking about Jack's life and mine, comparing them. I asked myself which I'd rather have led, and the answer was Jack's. And I asked myself who I'd rather be, even with the unknown fate facing Jack. And the answer was still Jack. But it was too late for me, or was it? Maybe I could, in a way, still be him. So I asked myself, what would Jack do? WWJD, Gia whispered. What? Nothing. Okay, if you don't know this, then, and this, like, I don't really see them as much anymore, but a lot of people wore these bracelets for a very long time. They're kind of like these like rubber bands that they would wear, and it would be WWJD. What would Jesus do? And Gia is literally saying that. What would Jack do, right? And that's what he's saying. And now if you do understand, for Christians, then the whole idea of being a Christian is that you are a little Christ. You look at the life of Christ and then you say, I want to be like him. I want to work every day to be more like Christ. And so I want to compare my life to his, the choices he would make compared to the choices I would make. And I want my choices to match up with his choices. I want my value system to be his value system. I want to be just like him, right? That's what Tom is doing here, and even laying down his life, because Christ describes it this way, right? As what greater love than this, than to lay down your life for your friends? I don't think I got it exactly right, but I think I'm pretty close there. That Tom chooses to lay down his life for his brother because he thinks this is what Jack would do. This is what Jack actually did. He was willing to do this for Gia. And Gia was willing to do this for Vicky. And he's saying, wow, no one would do that for me. Um, but Jack would do this. Like, so I should be like Jack. And then finally on the next page, or this is 5 pages later, on page 420, then it says that this is, I think it's Gia who's speaking here. That, yeah, she says, describing Tom, this is after he's disappeared, but she's basically getting Tom or Jack caught up on what Tom said. She says, yes, but I gathered from what he said that he was in more than a little trouble, that he'd done a lot of wrong. Maybe his time with you changed him, made it possible for him to decide to do this. Maybe you showed him a different way to act, to behave. Literally, like, you taught him how to be like you. And because he learned to be more like you, he made this decision. So I really don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to make of that, because Jack is, as much as you admire him and as much as Gia can admire him and his value system, and he is being pulled into this cosmic war, that reading him like this Christ-like figure is an interesting thing, because it's complicated in the series. That he is, in some ways, this larger than life character who can do things that other people just can't do. But he does it because of his wits. He does it because he's clever. He does it because of some of the connections that he has with different people living in, this underground society under the law. But ultimately, he's still a pretty ordinary, regular guy. He is not a demigod. He is not a godlike figure, right? He's not a superhero. He's not even Batman. I mean that quite seriously. That Wilson says in the short story collection that he's got in Quick Fixes, at the beginning of it, then he describes Jack and he's like, he's not Batman. He's not even really trying to fix the justice system. He's not trying to do these big things. And Jack has no real interest in faith or religion, in any of that stuff. And yet at the same time, especially in this book, then Jack is being described in ways that I don't see how you can miss that, especially once, I pointed out, and I'm sure there's other elements in this book, but that's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different points where you get Jack described, his value system described in a way that matches up with the way people describe the Bible, which matches up with the life of Christ and what Christ does with people who come close to him, who know him, who study his life, who want to become more like him. I don't see how you can miss that, but I don't know what to do with that, because he's not a religious figure, and he's not a superhero. He's not a godlike figure. So I don't know whether there is any message behind that, that you can have this incredible value system without being religious. I don't know if that's the message, because Jack is not religious, or that if you just because I don't understand where the value system comes from, right? It just seems to be innate to Jack. He just seems to have it deep within himself of he knows what's right and he knows what's wrong, and he doesn't hesitate in doing right. He doesn't hesitate in opposing wrong. But where did that come from? Because it doesn't seem like it came from any kind of religious instruction from being younger. It doesn't even seem like it came from parenting, because certainly with his brother Tom doesn't have the same value system at all. Kate seems to have had a pretty good value system, but different than Jack's, and even his father has got a good value system, but still different than Jack's. So I don't know how you imitate that. Like, because where did it come from? He wouldn't outline it. He's not trying to convert people to the ways of Jack. He is an outlier in the system. And so everybody can't live like him. Everybody can't do the things that he does. So I genuinely don't know what to do other than to just point out that I am still thinking through that idea as I'm reading this, but I don't see how you can miss that. And if you have got thoughts on that, please let me know, because I'm very curious about this idea of, yeah, what do you do when Jack gets described as in religious terms? What does that mean for the series? What is the purpose behind this? Is there a purpose behind this? What do you do as a reader when you encounter that? Because it is a very strange thing reading it and then just going, you're not describing Jack, you're describing God. You're not describing Jack, you're describing Scripture, you're describing Christ. And so, yeah, it's interesting. So that's really all that I had to say with Infernal. Like I say, please, if you've got thoughts on that or anything, about anything that I said, it doesn't have to just be on those religious themes, then please let me know. And the book that is coming after this is Harbinger, so you can look for the short spoiler free review video for that, and then I'll have the long discussion video the following week. All right, thanks so much for watching. Bye.